This is the tale of how my life was completely turned upside down twice, and my name is Emily. I suppose I ought to begin at the beginning. In a tiny suburban town, I was born to devoted parents, Larry and Joanna David. My mother was a nurse, and my father was a journalist. Although we were poor, we were content. Before I was 14, my life was rather typical. After that, everything changed. My folks were traveling home from a dinner party on a wet Friday night. The phone rang as my granny and I were watching a ridiculous cartoon at home. I will never forget the shiver that shot down my spine upon hearing my grandmother sob quietly in the kitchen. The days that followed were a haze. Mom had perished instantly in the crash. They told us. Dad made it through, but not by much. He was only a shadow of the man I knew when I saw him for the first time in the hospital. With his legs crushed, the doctor said he would never walk normally. Whispering, "Emily," he reached for my hand and said, "I'm so sorry, sweetie. I truly apologize." I didn't know why he was expressing regret. He wasn't at blame. Their car had been hit by an inebriated driver. But as I grew older, I came to understand that he was sorry for our circumstances, the challenges ahead, my mother's passing, and the father he felt he could no longer be. However, my father, Larry David, underestimated his own strength. Once he was discharged from the hospital and got used to living in a wheelchair, he gave his work his all. He was an accomplished writer who now devoted all of his energies to his work as an editor at the city's leading newspaper. Dad made sure I had what I needed as I approached adolescence. He urged me to get involved in clubs, meet people, and lead a typical life. In all honesty, I liked to spend time with him more. He helped me with my homework, we argued about books, and we watched old films together. Dad insisted I go away to school when it was time for me to attend college. "You need to spread your wings, kiddo," he stated. "Kindly forget about me. I'll be all right." Though I was hesitant, I decided to enroll in college since I knew he was right. I studied accounting at the State University of New York. I met Emma there, and she ended up being my best friend. I got to know Paul, her second cousin, through Emma. Paul was witty and polite, and when I told him about my dad, he didn't bat an eyelash. He actually hit it off with Dad the first time he saw him, instantly connecting over their love of vintage rock. Paul told me later, "You're amazing for taking care of your dad all these years, and your dad is cool." I attempted to hide the fact that I was shining on the inside. For the first time since the accident, I began to believe that one day I would actually be able to lead a regular life. One filled with love, laughter, and perhaps even my own family. After graduation, everything began to fit together like a puzzle. Paul started working as a long-haul truck driver, and I was hired by the local tax agency. After 4 years of dating, on a cool autumn evening in the park, where we went on our first date, he asked me to marry him. Though I was ecstatic, there was one thing I should clarify. "Yes, Paul, but I'm unable to part from my dad. I'm needed by him." Paul smiled wide and said, "I wouldn't have it any other way. We'll all live together. Your dad's apartment is big enough for the three of us, right?" The wedding was small but beautiful. Dad insisted on wheeling himself down the aisle to give me away. There wasn't a dry eye in the place as I stood there holding Paul's hand. I felt like I was living a fairy tale. But every fairy tale has its villains, and mine came in the form of my mother-in-law, Mar, and my sister-in-law, Olivia. From the moment I met them, I could tell they didn't approve of me. "So your father is handicapped?" Maria asked during our first meeting, wrinkling her nose as if she smelled something bad. "He's disabled," I corrected, trying to stay calm. "But he works as an editor." "How nice," she interrupted, clearly not interested. Then she turned to Paul and asked, "Are you sure about this? There are so many nice girls from good families." I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment, but Paul immediately defended me. Mom, Emily is from a good family. Her dad's disability doesn't change that. I love her, and that's all that matters. That shut Maria up, but I could still see the disapproval in her eyes. Olivia, following her mother's lead, was just as cold towards me. After the wedding, true to his word, Paul moved in with Dad and me, and our life settled into a comfortable routine. I'd go to work at the tax office while Paul was on the road for days at a time. When he was home, we'd all have dinner together. But whenever Maria and Olivia visited, the atmosphere in our home changed. They acted like they owned the place, barely acknowledging Dad's presence. Once I overheard Maria whispering to Olivia, "It's a shame. Paul could have done so much better. Now he's stuck with this girl and her crippled father. What if they have children? Can you imagine the genes?" I was furious, but I kept quiet for Paul's sake. I tried to keep the peace, but it was getting harder and harder. One evening, after a particularly tense visit from Maria and Olivia, I broke down in tears. Paul found me in our bedroom, crying. Hey, he said, pulling me into his arms. "What's wrong?" "Your mom and sister," I sobbed. "They hate me. They think I'm not good enough for you because of Dad." Paul's face hardened. "That's ridiculous. You and your dad are my family now. If they can't accept that, it's their problem, not ours." His words comforted me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of our troubles with Maria and Olivia. As the months went by, Paul's trucking business began to grow. He was always on the road, traveling across the country in his big rig. I missed him terribly when he was gone, but I focused on my work at the tax office and spent my evenings keeping Dad company. One crisp autumn evening, as I was helping Dad into bed, Paul called. His voice crackled with excitement over the phone. "Emily, I've been thinking," he said. "How would you feel about buying a townhouse? It would be easier for your dad to move around in a wheelchair. He could spend more time outside. Plus, you could have a garden, something to keep you busy when I'm on the road." The more he talked, the more I liked the idea. I glanced at Dad, who was pretending not to be interested. "What do you think, Dad?" I asked, putting the phone on speaker. Dad's eyes lit up. "A garden would be nice," he admitted. "And it would be easier to get outside." That settled it. Over the next few weeks, we threw ourselves into house hunting. We finally found the perfect place, a spacious townhouse with wide doorways, a roll-in shower for Dad, and a beautiful backyard. Taking out a mortgage was scary, but with Paul's income, mine, and the rent from Dad's old apartment, we managed to make it work. We moved in on a sunny Sunday in spring, and I'll never forget the look on Dad's face as he wheeled himself out onto our new patio. "This is perfect, sweetie," he said, his eyes misty. "Thank you." We spent the next few months settling in and making the place our own. I planted a small vegetable garden, and Dad would sit outside for hours, enjoying the sunshine and fresh air. It was peaceful, almost perfect. Then we decided to have a housewarming party. We invited friends, colleagues, and yes, even Maria and Olivia. The party was in full swing when they showed up fashionably late as usual. They walked in, looking around with barely hidden envy. As we walked through the house, I could see Maria thinking about something. When we reached the master bedroom, she turned to me with a sly smile. "You know, Emily," she said quietly, "this would be perfect for Paul and me. Why don't you send your father to a nursing home? Then I could move in here." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Excuse me," I managed to say. "Oh, don't look so shocked," Maria continued. "Your father isn't well. He's not a whole person anymore, is he? He doesn't need all this luxury." A nursing home would be more than enough for someone in his condition. Before I could respond, Maria marched out to the patio where Dad was talking with some guests. To my horror, she grabbed the handles of his wheelchair and started pushing him toward the driveway. "Maria," I shouted, running after her. "What are you doing?" "If he won't go to a nursing home, he can stay outside," she sneered. "That's what you wanted, isn't it? For him to be outdoors." I was shaking with rage and disbelief. Thankfully, Paul heard the commotion and came running. His face turned red with anger when he saw what his mother was doing. "Mom," he yelled, "what the hell are you doing? Let go of Larry's chair right now." Maria looked shocked by Paul's tone, but honey, I was just. "I don't want to hear it." Paul cut her off. "You and Olivia need to leave now." After they left, Paul apologized over and over to Dad and me. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I had no idea she would do that. I'm just so sorry." Dad reached out and patted Paul's hand. "It's not your fault, son," he said gently. "Some people just can't understand." Life settled into a new routine after that incident. Maria and Olivia kept their distance, which was fine with me. Paul focused on his work, taking on more long-haul routes to help pay for our new home. I split my time between my job at the tax office, taking care of our home, and looking after Dad. 4 years passed quickly. Our life became comfortable and predictable. Paul was on the road most of the time, but when he was home, our little family was happy. Dad's health was stable, and he seemed content spending his days in the garden or working on his editing from home. Then came the call that shattered my world. I was at work when my phone rang. A man's unfamiliar voice greeted me. "Mrs. Walker, this is Officer Andrew from the Highway Patrol." My heart sank. Yes, I barely managed to say. "I'm sorry to inform you that your husband, Paul Walker, has been in a serious accident." The rest of the conversation was a blur. Words like head-on collision and didn't make it floated around me, but I couldn't understand them. It wasn't until I heard myself thanking the officer and hanging up that the reality began to hit me. Paul was gone. The next week was a fog of grief and disbelief. I went through the motions of planning the funeral like a robot, barely understanding what was happening. The day before the funeral, I gathered my courage and called Maria. I thought she deserved to hear about her son's death from me, not from a newspaper obituary. "Hello," Maria's sharp voice answered. "Maria, it's Emily," I said, my voice trembling. "It's about Paul. He's gone. There was an accident." There was silence on the other end of the line, and then, to my shock, Maria's voice came back dripping with anger. "This is your fault," she hissed. "You made him work so hard, driving that truck to pay for your fancy house. You've killed my son." I was stunned. "Maria, Save it," she snapped. "I expect you to give him the best funeral money can buy, but don't expect a penny from us. You made your bed, now lie in it." The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, tears streaming down my face. How could she be so cruel? How could she blame me for this? The day of Paul's funeral was gray and rainy, matching my mood perfectly. The church was full. Paul was well-liked in the community, and it seemed like half the town had come to pay their respects. After the service, as people passed by to offer their condolences, I noticed that Paul's mother and sister were nowhere to be seen. They hadn't even bothered to show up for their own son and brother's funeral. Dad reached out and squeezed my hand. "It's their loss, sweetie. We're family, and we'll get through this together." As we pulled into our driveway, something seemed off. The lights were on in the house, which was strange because I was sure I had turned everything off before we left. "Did you leave any lights on, Dad?" I asked, frowning. He shook his head. No, I don't think so. As we got closer, I noticed movement inside the house. My heart started pounding. Were we being robbed on the day of Paul's funeral? I quickly helped Dad out of the car and into his wheelchair, my mind racing. Should I call the police? But as we approached the front door, I heard familiar voices inside. A chill ran down my spine as I recognized them. I pushed open the door to find Maria and Olivia in our living room, surrounded by boxes and pieces of furniture. What the hell is going on here? I demanded my grief, momentarily forgotten in the face of this outrageous intrusion. Maria turned to me, her face a mask of fake sympathy. "Oh, Emily dear, we're just helping you pack up. After all, you can't possibly afford to keep this place now that Paul is gone." I was speechless. Olivia added, her voice sickeningly sweet, "Don't worry. You can go back to your father's apartment. It's cozy." I could feel the anger building inside me. "Get out," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my house right now." Maria had the nerve to look offended. "This house belongs to us now. All of Paul's property does. We're his family after all." "Like hell you are." I exploded. "Where were you today at his funeral?" "Oh, that's right. You couldn't be bothered to show up." Maria waved her hand dismissively. "We were busy making arrangements. Now be a good girl and start packing. We'll meet you out by tomorrow." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These women hadn't shed a tear for Paul, hadn't even attended his funeral, and now they were trying to kick us out of our home. "I'm calling the police," I said, pulling out my phone. Maria and Olivia exchanged worried looks. They clearly hadn't expected me to fight back. "Now, Emily," Maria began, but I cut her off. "No, you have exactly 10 minutes to get out of my house before I call the cops. This is my home. Paul and I bought it together. You have no right to be here." Maybe it was the steel in my voice or the fire in my eyes, but Maria and Olivia finally realized they had gone too far. They gathered their things and left, but not before Maria turned to me with a sneer. "This isn't over, Emily. You'll be hearing from our lawyers." The days after Paul's funeral were a blur of grief, anxiety, and paperwork. I threw myself into sorting out Paul's affairs, partly to keep busy and partly out of fear that Maria and Olivia would try to take what wasn't theirs. A week after the funeral, I received a call from a local law firm. My heart pounded as I answered the call, afraid it was Maria following through on her threat of legal action. "Mrs. Walker," a crisp professional voice asked. "This is Scott Thompson from Thompson and Partners. I'm calling about your late husband's will." I felt a small flicker of hope. His will? I didn't know he had one. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Walker came to see us about 5 months ago. He asked that we contact you in the event of his passing." I scheduled an appointment for the next day, my mind spinning. Why hadn't Paul told me about this? What did it mean? The next morning, I wheeled Dad into Mr. Thompson's office. The lawyer greeted us warmly, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Mrs. Walker, Mr. David, thank you for coming in," he said, gesturing for us to sit near his desk. "I'm sorry for your loss." Mr. Thompson opened a file on his desk. "Now, as I mentioned on the phone, your husband came to see us to draft his will. He was very clear about his wishes." I held my breath as Mr. Thompson began to read. "I, Paul Walker, being of sound mind, do hereby leave all my worldly possessions to my beloved wife, Emily Walker." I gasped, and Dad's grip on my hand tightened. Mr. Thompson continued, "This includes our home, my truck, and all our savings. It is my wish that Emily use these resources to care for herself and her father, Larry David, whom I have come to love as my own." Tears streamed down my face. Even from beyond the grave, Paul was taking care of us. "There's more," Mr. Thompson said gently. "Mr. Walker left a letter for you." He handed me an envelope. With shaking hands, I opened it and began to read. "My dear Emily, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm so sorry for leaving you and Larry. Please know that you two are the best thing that ever happened to me. I made this will because I know how my mother and sister can be. I didn't want to worry you, but I needed to make sure you and Larry were protected if anything happened to me. You're my real family, Emily, you and Larry, not them. Take care of each other, live your lives to the fullest, and know that I'll always be watching over you. All my love, Paul." I clutched the letter to my chest, sobbing. Dad was crying too, his weathered hand patting my arm. Mr. Thompson gave us a moment before speaking again. "Mrs. Walker, there's one more thing. Your husband's truck was insured. Given the circumstances of the accident, the insurance company will be paying out the full value of the policy." I looked up, sniffling, and asked, "What does that mean?" Mr. Thompson gave me a small smile and said, "It means you'll be receiving a large sum of money, enough to pay off your mortgage and more." As we left the lawyer's office, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. We were going to be okay. Paul had made sure of it. As we pulled into our driveway, I noticed a familiar car parked on the street. My heart sank as I recognized Maria's sleek sedan. "Oh no," I muttered. "What now?" Sure enough, Maria and Olivia were waiting on our front porch. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I had Paul's letter in my pocket and the strength of his love in my heart. "Emily," Maria began as we approached, her voice sickly sweet, "we need to talk about Paul's estate." I stood tall, looking her straight in the eye. "No, Maria, we don't. Paul left everything to me. It's all legal and official. And you want to know why? Because we were his real family, not you. Now please leave. You're trespassing on my property." For once, Maria was speechless. Olivia tugged at her arm, whispering urgently. With one last venomous glare, they got in their car and drove away. The weeks after our meeting with the lawyer were busy. I threw myself into settling Paul's affairs, grateful for the distraction from my grief. The insurance payout came through, and just as Mr. Thompson had said, it was enough to pay off our mortgage with plenty left over. One afternoon, as I was going through Paul's desk, I found a small notebook. Curious, I opened it and saw pages filled with his messy handwriting. It was a journal of sorts, full of his thoughts and plans for our future. One entry read, "Thinking about starting a college fund for our future kids. I want to make sure they have the best start in life." My heart clenched. We had talked about having children someday, but had decided to wait until we were more financially stable. Now, reading Paul's private hopes and dreams, I felt a fresh wave of grief wash over me. "Oh, Paul," I whispered, holding the notebook close. We had so many plans. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. My mind kept drifting to the journal, to the future we'd never have. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of Paul. He was smiling, holding out his hand to me. "It's okay, Emily," he said in my dream. "Everything's going to be all right." I woke up the next morning feeling different. I couldn't quite figure out what it was, but something had changed. As I got ready for work, a wave of nausea hit me, and I barely made it to the bathroom in time. The morning sickness didn't go away in the days that followed. At first, I thought it was just stress and grief, but a small voice in the back of my mind suggested something else. After a week of this, I found myself in the pharmacy, staring at pregnancy tests with trembling hands. I bought one and hurried home. The 5 minutes I waited for the result felt like the longest of my life. When I finally looked at the test, there were 2 clear blue lines. I sank to the bathroom floor, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions: joy, fear, grief, and hope, all swirling together. "Emily." Dad's voice came through the door. "Everything okay in there?" I opened the door, tears streaming down my face. Dad's expression changed from concern to alarm. "What's wrong, sweetie?" he asked. I held up the test, my hand shaking. "I'm pregnant, Dad." I fell into his arms, sobbing. He held me, stroking my hair like he used to when I was a little girl. "It's okay," he murmured. "It's going to be okay. You're not alone, Emily. And this baby is a gift." His words hit me deeply. This baby was a part of Paul, a continuation of our love. Suddenly, the fear began to fade, replaced by a strong determination. "You're right," I said, wiping my eyes. "This baby is a gift, and we're going to be okay." Dad smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's my girl. Now let's get you something to eat. You're eating for two now, after all." As we headed to the kitchen, I felt a sense of hope growing inside me. The road ahead would be challenging, but with my father by my side and Paul's child growing inside me, I knew we could face anything. As my belly grew with our child, I found strength I never knew I had. Dad was my rock, always there with a kind word or a helping hand. We settled into a new routine, just the two of us, eagerly waiting for the arrival of the newest member of our little family. One sunny afternoon, as I was tending to the garden Dad and I had planted together, I heard a car pull up. My heart sank as I recognized Maria's sedan. What could they possibly want now? I walked to the front of the house, one hand instinctively resting on my swollen belly. Maria and Olivia stood on our porch, looking both comfortable and slightly desperate. "Emily," Maria began, her voice missing its usual sharpness, "we need to talk to you." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Olivia spoke up, her eyes darting around nervously. "We've hit some hard times. We were wondering if we could stay in your father's old apartment, just until we get back on our feet." I was hearing things that I couldn't believe. They dared to ask for more after everything they had made us go through. Saying in a calm yet forceful voice, "I'm sorry, that isn't achievable. I would like to stop talking to you." Maria's shocked and disgusted expression contorted as her eyes tightened at my growing baby bulge. She shouted, "You're pregnant. Yet, you tiny whore. It's unbelievable that you've already found someone else. Paul's corpse remains warm even in the earth." Anger shot through me, but I swallowed it. Not bothering to explain that it was Paul's kid, I did not. I didn't want such a grandmother and aunt for my child. Rather, I gave Maria a shy, sly smile that seemed to make her feel even more uneasy. I answered gently, "My personal life is none of your business. Now I think it's time for you to leave." Maria seemed to want to add more, but she must have been stopped by something in my expression. She pivoted on her heel and seized Olivia's limb. I felt a wave of tranquility go over me as I watched them drive off. I had maintained my dignity, stood my ground, and shielded my family. Paul could have felt pleased with himself.
The day the tornado hit, I was at work, my mind buried in mundane tasks, unaware of the chaos brewing at home. It was a typical spring day in our small town, the kind where the weather can't decide between sunshine and storms. When my phone rang, displaying my neighbor's number, I felt a spike of unease. "Emily, you need to come home now," her voice trembled. "It's your house, the tornado." My heart sank. I rushed through the emptying streets, the sky a menacing shade of gray. Turning onto our street was like entering a nightmare. Trees uprooted, power lines down, our neighborhood looked like a war zone. And there, standing defiant yet wounded, was our home. The sight of it brought a lump to my throat. Windows shattered, the roof partially torn off, our beloved home was a shell of its former self. but it was still standing. That was something. Thankfully, no one was home when the tornado struck. My husband, Mark, and our 2 kids were safe, which was all that truly mattered. But as we stood there, surveying the damage, I felt a sense of loss for the life we had built within those walls. We spent the next few hours salvaging what we could. Our neighbors, true to the spirit of our tight-knit community, rallied around us, offering help and support. In the midst of this chaos, there was a sense of unity, a shared resolve to rebuild not just our home, but our lives. That evening, we found temporary refuge at my sister's house. Exhausted, I finally had a moment to sit down and check my phone. It buzzed relentlessly with messages and missed calls. As I scrolled through, one particular notification caught my eye. It was a Facebook post from my mother-in-law, Linda. The post was dramatic, to say the least, claiming our house was completely destroyed. I felt a surge of irritation. Linda had a penchant for exaggeration, especially on social media, but this was a new low, even for her. Can you believe this? I showed the post to Mark, who let out a weary sigh. She just doesn't get it, he said, his voice a mix of anger and resignation. She knows I hate it when she posts about our personal life. The post had already gathered a string of comments, people expressing shock and sorrow, offering prayers and help. It was a kind gesture from the community, but based on false pretenses. I wanted to correct the post, to set the record straight, but Mark placed a hand on my shoulder. Let's just deal with it tomorrow, he said. We've got enough on our plate right now. He was right, of course. But as I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, I couldn't shake off a growing sense of anger. Linda's actions, though perhaps well-intentioned, had crossed a line, and I was determined to make her understand that. The morning light did little to ease the heaviness in my heart. As I scrolled through the endless messages on my phone, Linda's post from last night glared back at me, a stark reminder of the unwanted drama unfolding alongside our real crisis. Sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, I pondered my next move. Mark, ever the peacemaker, suggested letting it go, focusing on our immediate needs instead. But the more I thought about it, the more Linda's actions bothered me. It wasn't just about the post. It was about respect, privacy, and understanding boundaries. I decided to call Linda, hoping a direct conversation might resolve the issue. The phone rang, and after a couple of tones, her cheerful voice filled the line. Emily, darling, how are you holding up? I've been so worried. Linda, we need to talk about your Facebook post, I said, cutting to the chase. There was a pause on the other end. Oh, that, she replied, her tone shifting. I was just trying to let our friends and family know what happened. Gather some support for you all. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my frustration in check. Linda, our house wasn't destroyed. It's badly damaged, yes, but your post is misleading, and Mark specifically dislikes personal matters being shared on social media. There was another pause, longer this time. Well, I didn't mean any harm, she said defensively. I just wanted to help. I softened my tone. I appreciate that, Linda, but this isn't the way. Can you please correct the post? People are worried unnecessarily. There was a reluctant murmur of agreement from her before we ended the call. I felt a small victory, but the irritation lingered. I couldn't shake off the feeling that Linda's actions were more about garnering attention for herself than genuinely helping us. The rest of the day was a blur of phone calls and arrangements, insurance agents, contractors, family members offering help. In the midst of it all, I kept thinking about Linda and the impact of her thoughtlessness. It was a small part of a much larger problem, but it felt symbolic of the lack of understanding and respect that had always tinged our relationship. That evening, as we gathered at my sister's house for a makeshift dinner, the conversation inevitably turned to the Facebook fiasco. My sister, always the outspoken one, didn't mince words. You should give her a taste of her own medicine, she said, half joking. See how she likes it when her personal business is all over the internet. Her words, meant in jest, sparked an idea in my mind. A plan began to form, one that would teach Linda a lesson in a way she wouldn't expect. It was risky, potentially petty, but at that moment it felt like the perfect response to an ongoing problem. The next day dawned with a sense of purpose for me. As I surveyed the damage to our home once more, I couldn't help but think about the unnecessary chaos Linda's post had caused. The more I reflected on it, the more it felt like a symptom of a much larger issue in our relationship with her. She often overstepped boundaries without considering the consequences, and this time I was determined to make her realize the impact of her actions. Meanwhile, the ripple effect of Linda's exaggerated post continued. Mark's aunt, who had taken the post at face value, had shared her own version of the story, further distorting the truth. This led to a cascade of concerned calls and messages, adding to our already overwhelming situation. Mark, seeing the stress it was causing, finally agreed that something needed to be done. "I just don't understand why she always has to make things about her," he said, frustration evident in his voice. As we sat in the living room of my sister's house, surrounded by a few salvaged belongings, the reality of our situation hit me. We were in the middle of a crisis, yet part of our energy was being drained by a needless social media drama. That evening, I started to put my plan into action. It was simple, yet effective. I would give Linda a taste of her own medicine by sharing a post about her on Facebook. But not just any post. It would be a carefully crafted story, exaggerated just enough to make a point, yet harmless enough not to cause real damage. I spent some time composing the post, ensuring it was just right. "Feeling grateful for Linda," I began, "who bravely saved a stray cat during the storm and is now nursing it back to health at home." It was a complete fabrication, of course, but plausible enough to be believed. I hesitated for a moment before hitting post. This was not my usual style, but desperate times called for desperate measures. I thought about the stress her post had caused us, and with a mix of apprehension and determination, I shared the story. Within minutes, the post started to gain traction. Comments poured in, praising Linda's heroism and kindness. I watched as the notifications flooded in, a part of me feeling guilty for stooping to her level, yet another part feeling a sense of vindication. The following day, Linda called, flustered and overwhelmed by the attention the post had garnered. "Emily, I don't know what to do. Everyone is asking about this cat, and I don't even have one." I tried to keep my voice steady. "It's overwhelming when people share things about you on social media, isn't it?" There was a long pause on the other end. I see your point," she finally said, her voice a mixture of embarrassment and realization. It was a small victory, but an important one. Linda had finally experienced firsthand the impact of her actions. It was a lesson in empathy, delivered through the very medium she couldn't resist. The aftermath of my Facebook post was immediate and revealing. The phone call with Linda had ended on an awkward note, but it sparked a necessary conversation. Later that day, she came over to my sister's house, a rare gesture of humility in her eyes. "I didn't realize how my actions affected you and Mark," Linda began, her usual confident demeanor replaced by a hint of vulnerability. "I never intended to cause you more stress." I appreciated her effort to understand, but years of accumulated frustration bubbled to the surface. "Linda, it's not just about the post. It's about respecting our privacy. Mark has told you many times he doesn't like personal things shared on social media." Linda nodded, looking genuinely remorseful. "I guess I got carried away with wanting to be a part of everything. I didn't think about the consequences." The conversation that followed was long overdue. We talked about boundaries, respect, and the importance of communication. For the first time, I felt like Linda was truly listening, not just hearing what she wanted to. Mark joined us, and together, we began to untangle the complicated web of our family dynamics. It was a difficult conversation, filled with moments of tension and relief, but it was necessary, a step towards understanding and healing. As Linda left, she turned to me. "Thank you for the eye-opener, Emily. I promise to be more thoughtful in the future." The confrontation had been cathartic, but it left me with mixed feelings. My plan had worked, but I couldn't shake off the guilt of using deception, even if it was for a good cause. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. We began the arduous process of repairing our home, buoyed by the support of our community. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a sense of purpose and determination. In the midst of the chaos, I often found myself reflecting on the confrontation with Linda. It had been a turning point, not just in our relationship with her, but in how I viewed conflicts and resolutions. I realized that sometimes it takes a drastic measure to bring about change, but the real challenge lies in handling the consequences with grace and understanding. As we slowly put our home and lives back together, I felt a newfound sense of resilience. The tornado had taken much from us, but it had also given us something unexpected, a chance to rebuild, not just our house, but our relationships and ourselves. In the days following the confrontation with Linda, there was a palpable shift in our family dynamics. The air was clearer, albeit still tinged with the remnants of past grievances. Linda's visits became more considerate, and our conversations more meaningful. Yet a part of me remained wary, unconvinced that old habits could change so quickly. As we navigated through the complexities of rebuilding our home, I found myself mulling over the effectiveness of my little plot. It was a tactic I was not proud of, but it had sparked a necessary change. This realization led me to reflect on the concept of revenge. Was it always a negative impulse, or could it, in some contexts, be a catalyst for positive change? I discussed these thoughts with Mark one evening as we sat amidst boxes of salvaged belongings at my sister's house. I keep thinking about what I did with that Facebook post, I admitted. Part of me feels guilty, but another part feels like it was the only way to get through to your mom. Mark took my hand, his eyes understanding. I know it wasn't easy for you, but it did make a difference. Sometimes we need to shake things up to make people see things differently. Encouraged by his words, I started to view my actions in a different light. Revenge, in its many forms, is often seen as a petty or destructive force. But in this case, it had served as a mirror, reflecting the consequences of one's actions back at them. This perspective became a source of strength for me. As we worked through the endless tasks of restoration and dealing with insurance claims, I found a newfound assertiveness. I was no longer hesitant to speak my mind, especially when it came to decisions about our home and family. Linda, for her part, seemed to have taken the lesson to heart. Her interactions with us became more thoughtful, and she was noticeably more restrained on social media. It was a small, yet significant change, one that improved the overall atmosphere whenever we gathered as a family. During this period, I also learned the importance of forgiveness. Holding on to anger and resentment was like carrying a heavy burden, that one that I no longer wished to bear. Forgiving Linda did not mean forgetting what had happened, but it allowed me to move forward without the weight of past conflicts. As our home slowly came back to life, so did our spirits. The process of rebuilding was not just about repairing walls and roofs, but about mending relationships and redefining boundaries. The storm had brought destruction, but in its wake it left room for growth and renewal. The reconstruction of our home progressed steadily, a tangible symbol of our family's resilience. With each repaired wall and repainted room, I felt a sense of accomplishment and hope. This period of rebuilding was not just physical, it was emotional and relational as well. My plan, which had initially been born out of frustration and a desire for revenge, had unexpectedly opened a path to healing and understanding. Linda's transformation, though gradual, was evident. She became more mindful of her words and actions, showing a level of consideration that was previously absent. One weekend, as we were unpacking some boxes in the newly restored living room, Linda dropped by, unannounced yet welcome. She came bearing a homemade cake, a small but significant gesture. We sat around the kitchen table, savoring the cake and the comfort of easy conversation. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Linda began, her tone reflective. "I realize now how much I've overstepped in the past. I'm sorry for the stress I caused you both." Her apology was sincere, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was the closure I hadn't realized I needed. "Thank you, Linda," I said, meaning every word. "It means a lot to us." As we talked, I saw a new side of Linda. She listened more than she spoke, her responses thoughtful and considerate. It was a stark contrast to the Linda I had known, the one who always seemed to be at the center of every conversation. This change in Linda had a ripple effect on our family dynamics. Mark and I found ourselves looking forward to her visits, appreciating her efforts to be a better mother and mother-in-law. Our conversations delved deeper, moving beyond surface-level pleasantries to genuine discussions about life, dreams, and fears. In these moments, I realized the power of communication and empathy. My initial plan, conceived in a moment of frustration, had unknowingly paved the way for a deeper connection. It was a reminder that sometimes the most challenging situations can lead to the most profound transformations. As our home neared completion, so did our journey of reconciliation and understanding. The experience had taught us the value of patience, forgiveness, and the strength of family bonds. We had weathered the storm, both literal and metaphorical, emerging stronger and more united. With our home fully restored and our family relationships on a new, healthier trajectory, I took a moment to reflect on the journey we had undergone. The once damaged walls of our home now stood strong and vibrant, echoing the transformation within our family. Linda's evolution was the most remarkable. The once overbearing and intrusive mother-in-law had become a thoughtful and considerate part of our lives. Her change was not just in her actions, but in her understanding of us as a family. She respected our boundaries and became an integral, positive force in our lives. This transformation was not lost on our extended family and friends. They noticed the change in dynamics, often commenting on the newfound harmony at family gatherings. It was a testament to the power of communication and the willingness to change. As for me, the entire ordeal had been a profound learning experience. I had confronted a challenging situation with a plan that, in retrospect, was risky and could have backfired. But it had led to a positive outcome, teaching me the importance of standing up for what I believed was right, albeit in a non-conventional way. I shared these reflections with Mark one evening as we sat in our rejuvenated living room. I never thought that a plan born out of frustration would lead to such a positive change, I mused. Mark smiled, taking my hand. Sometimes it's the unexpected paths that lead us to the best destinations. I'm just glad we've come out of this stronger as a family. The incident with the tornado and the subsequent fallout with Linda had brought us closer together. It had shown us the strength of our bond, the resilience of our family, and the transformative power of empathy and understanding. Our home, once a symbol of loss and chaos, had become a haven of love and unity. It stood as a reminder that out of destruction can come growth, and out of conflict can come harmony. We had not only rebuilt our home, but had also restructured our family dynamics into something stronger and more meaningful. As I looked around at the walls that had witnessed so much, I felt a deep sense of peace and gratitude. We had weathered the storm, and in its wake, we found a deeper appreciation for each other and the home we shared.
You can't even afford the fancier cuts of meat, even if you're at a BBQ establishment, can you? The impoverished have more than enough pickles. David, a banker who used to be my classmate, scowled down at me and violently dumped a plate of juicy pickles. I gave my mother a red cardigan, and the plate fell straight into it. Are you even aware of your actions? I might forgive you if you apologize immediately. Why ought I to? From Evergreen Bank, I'm David. Say you're sorry for being such a loser. Wasn't I just sharing some pickles? He smirked without even trying to hide it. I understand. I can plainly comprehend what you're thinking. Let's transfer the $30 million to a different bank, Mom. He stood there in disbelief, unable to comprehend what was happening. The next day, everything drastically altered, yet he never took me seriously. I'm a 36-year-old ex-banker named Scott. My mother and I were the only ones left when my father died when I was in high school. Using scholarships, I was able to complete my college education, but I left my job shortly after I started working. Since then, my life has finally stabilized and I've adapted to a new work. We went to my mother's favorite BBQ joint today to honor her 60th birthday and to express my gratitude. She was so happy that she put on the red cardigan I gave her as a birthday present immediately away. My mom was contentedly munching on cucumber pickles as we grilled tongue and short ribs. She grinned and continued, even though it was her special day and I wanted her to eat more of the meat she loves. Thank you, but these pickles from the barbecue place are my favorite. I'm also loving the meat, so don't worry. We kept eating happily until the door to the private room burst open, because if my mom is pleased, that's what counts. Hey, isn't Scott there? You appear to be doing well, but I haven't seen you since you ran away from work. My old classmate David, who used to work at the bank, was the voice. As high school classmates, David and I were always vying for the best grades. But I was usually a little bit ahead, which unilaterally made him despise me, so our unplanned encounter was really awkward. He always viewed me as a rival in high school. Don't act snobby just because you're good at studying. Our guest just so happened to be correct this time. Even though he was just as intelligent as I was, his constant defeats of me most likely resulted into animosity. He even continued to be loyal to me while attending the same institution and working at the same evergreen bank in the area. After 3 years of employment, the branch manager changed, which caused a change in our relationship. We were pushed to sell goods and services aggressively when the company plan was redesigned. I kept questioning whether our clients were actually benefiting from these goods and services. I started to question if I was truly taking the customer's viewpoint into account as I made offers to devoted clients and won contracts. Even as I adapted to the job, these uncertainties continued to plague me. The transfer order then arrived. Although I was aware that frequent transfers were intended to deter wrongdoing, my mother was the actual issue at the time. The phrase, "don't take your parents for granted," is frequently used. Prior to receiving a major medical diagnosis, my mother had always been in good health. I was shocked and hurried home, where my mother smiled wearily at me. "Despite your busy schedule, I appreciate you coming. Don't worry, though. Surgery should guarantee that my life is not in risk because it was identified early enough." At first, I was relieved, but as our conversation progressed, I came to understand that things weren't as promising as they appeared. Despite the high success rate of the surgery, my mom would have to recuperate at home for a long period, which would make it hard for her to even handle everyday tasks, much less go shopping. She needed help getting to and from the hospital, and she would need urgent care if her condition deteriorated at home. To put it another way, someone would have to help my mom all day. It became evident after talking with my mom's primary care physician that daytime living alone would be difficult. After much consideration, I made the decision to leave the bank in light of my mom's predicament. Moving to a far-off place and leaving my mom alone was not an option, and I had been uncomfortable with the bank's regulations. My boss was sad when I resigned and made an effort to convince me to stay. My mom's health came first, even though I felt bad about leaving a location that had been kind to me. So I walked out of the bank. I haven't had any regrets about my choice in the past 3 years. However, it appeared to be the first time David believed he had defeated me. He approached my desk the day before I was to go, smirking as he said, "Lucky for you that your mom got sick just in time." His unexpected and cruel words shocked me. I was already tense with my mom's upcoming surgery. I couldn't understand how he could say something so cruel at a time like this, but he just watched my speechless reaction and started laughing disdainfully. "Don't make excuses. You just couldn't handle the bank's quotas and ran away because you couldn't cut it in sales, right? Is that all you came to say? Bad timing. I've got handover work to do, so please move aside." I managed to reply, holding back my anger. He scoffed and continued, "Being smart at school doesn't mean you can hack it in the real world. You've never faced failure before, so you were using your mom as an excuse to run away." Without the will to respond, I stayed silent. He got even more aggressive. "Must be nice, but quitting before everyone realizes you're a failure who can't meet company standards. What are you going to do now? Hide at home with your mom?" "Yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm staying home to take care of my mom, and I won't be working outside anymore, so leave me alone." I lied hastily to get rid of him. He burst into laughter as if he'd heard the funniest joke, then announced loudly across the office, "Hey, hear that? SC is going to become a shut-in from now on. He's retiring from society to be a bum." In the past, his smirking face would have left me feeling bitter, but now I see it as my final liberation from this unwanted, inseparable relationship with him. I calmly continued preparing the handover documents. After that, My mom successfully underwent her surgery and recovered at home as planned. She regained her health completely, and I began working again, establishing a new lifestyle. One day, we decided to celebrate her 60th birthday and her recovery at a barbecue restaurant, a special treat. She was happy with the present I prepared, and we were having a good time when he suddenly barged in. I saw you when you went to the restroom earlier and thought it might be you. Turns out it really was Scott, the loser. He smirked as he threw snide remarks at me, despite my mother being present. He barged into our private room to harass us, showing that his character hadn't changed a bit. Today is my mom's 60th birthday. We're here to enjoy this as a family, so please. I tried to speak calmly, hoping to get him to leave, but seeing an opportunity to tease me, his eyes gleamed with mischief as he decided to stay. Are you really eating pickles at a barbecue place? Isn't that just the appetizer? Oh, I get it. Since you declared you'd be a shut-in and not work, you must be broke now, he said, then smirked and left the room. Relieved he'd given up, I was momentarily at ease until he returned to our private room. He began transferring cucumber pickles from his own plate to ours without permission. You guys are really saving me here. I can't stand cheap taste like this. I was about to throw these pickles away, he said. Hey, don't put things on our plates without asking. I protested, but he just looked down on us, grinning. Be thankful you quit the bank and have no money, right? Even though you're at a barbecue place, you can afford the expensive meat, right? That's enough. I raised my voice, but he continued to look down on me condescendingly. Since you can afford to pay for the meat, I figured I'd share the pickles. Pickles are more than enough for the poor. His voice filled with malice, mercilessly bombarding my mother and me. I really wanted to retaliate strongly, but I managed to restrain myself. Today is a special day, my mother's 60th birthday. If I let anger ruin this joyous occasion, it would only trouble my mother, who was enjoying herself until now. With that in mind, I quietly urged him to leave. Can you please just leave now? Oh, I'm not running away today. Weren't you the one who quit the bank job crying because it was too tough? Looks like you should be the one to leave this restaurant, spineless. His taunting only made my blood boil, but causing a scene here would only trouble my mother. In the restaurant, I just ran into him today. David is someone I shouldn't even be meeting anymore. He's like a stone on the roadside, a traveler you pass by on a trip, never to see again. No matter how much he insults me, I just need to let it slide for now. If I don't respond, he'll get bored and leave soon. Thinking this, I remained silent, but this only seemed to irritate him further. Frustrated, he furrowed his brow and picked up the plate of pickles he had added earlier. Then he deliberately spilled the juicy pickles all over the plate, overturning it right onto the red cardigan I had gifted my mother. Yikes. Oops, sorry about that, ma'am. My hand slipped, he said, offering an insincere apology with a smirk as my mother's cardigan got drenched in pickle juice and cucumber slices. I quickly stood up to ask a server for a towel, but he grabbed a napkin from the table first. I'll wipe it off right away. Oh dear, my hands just slipped, he said, laughing loudly while crushing the cucumbers with a napkin. The smell of crushed cucumbers filled the private room, and a brand new cardigan was left stained. Oh, it was a gift for my mom's 60th birthday. Haha, sorry about that. Seems like I made it worse. He continued to laugh as if watching a funny skit, enjoying my mother's distress. At that moment, my anger shook me to the core. I could ignore whatever was said to me, but I couldn't forgive him for troubling my mother. David, are you still working at Evergreen Bank at the same branch as before? Yes, that's right. Unlike when you left, I'm about to be the branch manager. I'm the top rising star, an elite among our peers now, different from someone who quit halfway through. His voice echoed in the restaurant, attracting the attention of the staff and other customers who peeked into our private room as he continued to laugh. I stared him down, giving him one last chance. Do you even realize what you've done? Apologize right now, and I might still forgive you. Huh. Why should I? An elite from Evergreen Bank apologizing to a loser like you? I was just sharing some pickles, wasn't I? As he said this, he pointed at the pickle-stained cardigan and didn't even try to hide his smirk. I see. I understand your thoughts clearly, Mom. Let's move the $30 million to another bank. He stood there dumbfounded, unable to grasp the situation. Meanwhile, my mother looked confused at my words. What's going on? You've always wanted to repay your gratitude by dealing only with Evergreen Bank because you were working there after graduation. But a person from Evergreen Bank has insulted you and me. I kept my anger in check, but it seemed my irritation was evident to both my mother and him. I continued staring at his stiffened face. Listen, David, we both have social standings, and we're not kids anymore. If you dare insult us like this in public, you must be prepared for the consequences. So what? He responded brusquely, showing no intention of apology. I sighed deeply and said firmly, I'm done dealing with you. I've decided to transfer the $30 million we have at Evergreen Bank somewhere else. After this, you'll probably understand what kind of a mess you've really caused. What are you talking about? You're saying you have $30 million in deposits. That's not even a good joke. Go ahead and cancel it if you can. It seemed that he still didn't believe I had a $30 million deposit at the bank. It's embarrassing that you'd lie like that. Don't come crying to me when you regret it. If you can withdraw $30 million from our bank, I'll applaud you, but that's impossible for a shut and poor like you. We'll see who regrets it. I've only told the truth. Look forward to what happens tomorrow. With that, I left him sitting there as I got up from the table. As we paid and left the restaurant, he continued to mock us. Do you really think I'd believe such a pathetic bluff? I'm looking forward to seeing what happens to you guys. Ignoring his continued taunts, we headed home from the barbecue restaurant. He thought it was all a lie and didn't take it seriously. But the next day, everything changed. I heard from a former colleague that the Evergreen Bank was flooded with calls right after they opened the next day. Some people even went directly to the bank to inquire, and the staff was overwhelmed with responses. David, who had arrived at work as usual, was summoned by the furious manager. James, what's all this commotion about today? Did something happen? What have you done? James, usually calm, yelled as if he had lost control of himself. Vince stood out on his forehead, taken aback by the intensity. David apologized while trying to understand the situation. The phone lines are almost crashing because of the inquiries about what you did at the barbecue restaurant yesterday. What I did. Go out for barbecue yesterday. Confused, he wiped the sweat off his forehead. Then James showed him a video on his phone. It seems you caused a disturbance at the barbecue restaurant yesterday. There's a video of it online now, and it's causing a huge problem. The video is online. He grabbed the phone and focused intently on the small screen. The video showed the exchange between him and me from the previous day. Why is there a video of this? I don't know anything about it, but that's you, James said, his voice filled with disbelief. And the video. David calling someone poor and mocking them. What were you thinking? James's words made him spit in defiance. I just ran into an old friend by chance and got carried away joking around. Is it wrong to eat barbecue? And why is this video spreading? The fuss was so great that a customer at the restaurant recorded everything, then posted it online as a scandal involving a bank employee. At Chain's words, he began to tremble, turning pale. The video had already been viewed over 1 million times, and deleting it now wouldn't suppress the issue. My elite life is over. How can I solve this problem? Your elite life is over. That doesn't matter. What you did is a major issue, but the person you insulted was none other than. As they were talking, other bank employees came to call James and him. My mother and I had just arrived at the bank, as I had declared the day before. I was there to close the account and withdraw the $30 million. However, the counter staff informed me that such a large transaction couldn't be processed there and asked us to come to a private room where James would join us. The bank employee who guided us knew about yesterday's incident, so they decided to have him join the discussion too. David, who rushed in with James, began sweating profusely the moment he saw my mother and me. When James heard from the bank employee that I intended to withdraw the entire $30 million and close the account, he tried his best to persuade me to reconsider. Please reconsider. Can you at least tell us why? The reason? He knew it well. Yesterday, when I told him I would close the account, he readily agreed. He must have remembered his defiant words. He looked around uneasily and then took a few steps towards me to speak, but before he could say anything, James dropped a bombshell. What have you done angering our top client like this? This is irreversible. Scott is a top client. That must be some mistake. He's a quitter who left this bank halfway through, James said. You're making a terrible mistake, James. His anger seemed incomprehensible to him. He smirked as if he'd heard a joke and spoke dismissively. Scott is just a poor man. He certainly doesn't have $30 million. James's face, turning red with anger, got even angrier with him as he continued to make excuses. It's not a misunderstanding. He's saying he wants to withdraw $30 million from his savings. This man is the CEO of a major ID company. James exclaimed, finally realizing the truth of my words. After leaving the bank, I started managing assets from home and saving funds, which I then invested in a startup. By networking with talented entrepreneurs, I eventually founded and now run my own ID company. Hearing my background from James, he stood frozen, his face pale and silent. I spoke slowly to him. Now, do you understand that I wasn't joking? I can trust a bank where people like you work, but I didn't know. I'll apologize if you want. Just please don't withdraw your money from the bank. He was still condescending, disappointing not just me, but also others. James, who had witnessed everything, looked at him with disdain and anger. I thought you were a competent banker. What a disappointment. As you heard, ridiculing a customer and showing no remorse questions your integrity. I cannot entrust my assets to this bank. I reiterated my demand to withdraw the $30 million, and James sighed deeply, reluctantly agreeing. Thus, I withdrew all my assets from Evergreen Bank. He resisted to the end, shouting, "How can someone like you, who ran away from a tough job, succeed enough to have $30 million? Aren't you just a coward?" But I just shook my head calmly. Why do you criticize leaving so much? Assessing the situation and choosing a different path is not something to be ashamed of. But you abandoned your job and lost to me. Leaving from the workplace is proof of no responsibility. It seemed that being a banker was the only thing he could boast about as a victory over me. Hearing him insist, I felt pity rather than anger. It's great to work hard with responsibility, but no one wants to live with regrets by suppressing what they truly want to do. I recalled the day I decided to resign, faced with a promotion to a distant location and my mother's surgery, followed by difficult home care. When these two futures were presented to me, I chose my mother's health. There are people who will follow the path you aspire to, and there are those who will live like me. Everyone should choose the life that suits them best. You have to decide your own life. How is that different from being selfish? I work hard. I am going to be the most successful person in this bank. I am great. He kept repeating his argument, almost screaming by the end. When someone's thoughts become so rigid, advice from others no longer reaches them. I left the bank feeling sorry. A branch of Evergreen Bank closed down. Months later, I was driving my mother to the hospital. Her illness had fully improved, and now she only needed regular checkups, which was a relief. On the way to the hospital, we passed the location where Evergreen Bank once stood. The grand building had been demolished, leaving a clean slate. That David person was your classmate, wasn't he? My mother asked. I'm sorry. My 60th birthday celebration triggered all this, I replied. No, it's okay. He's always been like that, and it's good that the branch closed down, I said. My comment about the closure wasn't a joke. This information comes from a new acquaintance in the finance industry. According to him, ever since James took charge, the branch's reputation among customers had steadily declined. James had favored David, a high-performing banker, and together they changed management policies. Even during my time, we were forced to sell unnecessary products to customers. After I left, their methods became more blatant, treating customers who refused products as poor and behaving arrogantly while being overly courteous to big clients. This unfair treatment had been problematic for a while, and there were frequent complaints against Evergreen Bank itself. With the recent scandal, the bank could no longer protect James and David. As Evergreen Bank was already reducing staff by merging branches, they quickly decided to close the branch where David worked. Other bank employees were given placements elsewhere, but James and David were not offered decent transfers and were assigned to a department that only organized old documents all day. David, with his bruised pride, resigned voluntarily after enduring about a month. I deserve a much better job, he declared, slamming his resignation letter down before leaving the bank. James tried to cling to his job, but after David left, he was solely blamed for the branch's closure. Unable to withstand the cold treatment from colleagues and bosses, he followed David in resignation. Afterwards, James searched for a new job but couldn't find employment within the same industry due to his tarnished reputation. Nevertheless, needing to make a living, he eventually found a job as a bank security guard. Once a manager pushing unnecessary products for performance, he now finds himself humbly responding to customer complaints. On the other hand, David's life took a harsh turn after his wife divorced him and took their children with her. Forced to sell his home to pay for the divorce settlement and property division, he now lives alone in a cheap apartment. Currently, he works as a part-time employee at a local supermarket, struggling to make ends meet and pay child support. Interestingly, his manager and supervisor are former high school classmates whom he used to mock, but now he has no choice but to diligently follow their orders. He is assigned to the deli section where he sells items like potato salad and pickles daily. However, still clinging to his elitist attitude, he grumbles, "How can someone like me deal with something as poor-looking as pickles?" and neglects proper stock management. This results in poor sales, leading to frequent lectures from his once classmate, now supervisor. One can only hope that he will reflect on his behavior and change his way of living. As for my mother and me, we decided to redo her 60th birthday celebration. This whole experience made me reconsider what I truly value. I was reaffirmed that resigning was the right decision, and I felt deeply content with my choice. Mom, happy 60th birthday again. Without you, I wouldn't have had the chance to close that account. Let's continue to enjoy life in good health, I said. Thank you. I'm proud of you, my mother replied, smiling gently, obviously pleased. Motivated by these sentiments, I resolved to keep following the path I believe in. As I reflect on these thoughts, I open my computer again today to complete my work with pride.
My ruthless mother-in-law and husband burned down my cafe while I was still inside the building. I was badly injured and lost consciousness. Thankfully, my staff rushed me to the hospital to save my life. When I opened my eyes in the hospital, a big surprise awaited me, something I never expected. Life was never perfect, but it was mine. My name is Sophia, and I've always been a dreamer. At 28 years old, I owned a cozy little cafe tucked in the heart of a bustling city. It wasn't just a business. It was my sanctuary, a place where I poured my heart into every cup of coffee and every smile exchanged with my customers. People often told me the cafe had a certain magic, a warmth they couldn't quite explain. I like to think that magic was just love. When I met Mark, I thought my life was finally complete. He was older than me, 35, charming, and successful in his work as a business consultant. He seemed to understand my dreams and supported me in ways I thought were genuine. We got married within a year of meeting, and I was over the moon. But looking back, I can see the signs I missed. Small things, like his subtle attempts to insert himself into decisions about the cafe, or the way he dismissed my ideas as naive. And then there was his mother, Vivian. From the start, Vivian made it clear she didn't think much of me. She was a retired lawyer, sharp as a knife and twice as cold. "Sophia," she'd say with that condescending tone of hers, "you really should let Mark help you more. Running a business is no place for someone with no formal training." I always brushed her off, thinking she was just overprotective of her son. I couldn't have imagined how far she'd go to prove her point. At first, life seemed normal enough. Mark and I shared a small apartment near the cafe, and he'd occasionally drop by to help out. Mostly, though, he spent his days working with his clients. Vivian would visit once in a while, always making subtle digs about how I was running things. "This place could be so much more," she'd say, her eyes scanning the cafe like she was already imagining her version of it. I shrugged it off. What harm could a few comments do? But things began to change. Mark started coming to the cafe more often, offering to handle paperwork or help manage the books. He insisted it would take some pressure off me, and at first I was grateful. It wasn't until much later that I realized he was laying the groundwork for what was to come. One evening, I came home late from a long day at the cafe. Mark was already there, sitting at the dining table with Vivian. Papers were spread out before them, and they stopped talking the moment I walked in. "What's all this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Oh, just going over some ideas," Mark said quickly, shuffling the papers into a neat pile. Vivian smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Mark's been helping me think about how to secure the future of the cafe," she said. There was something in her tone, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't think much of it at the time, but little moments like that began to pile up. Mark started questioning my decisions more often, suggesting better ways to handle things. Vivian dropped by more frequently, always with unsolicited advice. I began to feel like a stranger in my own business, but I kept telling myself it was all in my head. One day, I was cleaning up after closing when I noticed something strange. A folder of financial records was missing from my office. I asked Mark about it, and he casually said he'd taken it home to review. "Just trying to help," he said with that easy smile of his. I wanted to believe him, but something about it didn't sit right. The real crack came a few weeks later. I'd gone to the back office to grab a file, and that's when I heard their voices. Mark and Vivian were in the main seating area, their voices low but unmistakable. "Once we get her to sign those documents, it'll all be ours," Vivian said, her words cutting through the air like a knife. My heart stopped. "She's not going to suspect a thing," Mark replied. "Sophia's too trusting." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My husband, the man I thought I could trust with my life, was plotting against me, with his own mother. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, their voices echoing in my head. When I finally moved, I slipped out of the back door and ran, my thoughts spinning wildly. That night, I didn't sleep. My mind replayed their words over and over, trying to make sense of it all. What documents were they talking about? How long had this been going on? Most of all, why? Why would they do this to me? As I stared out the window at the empty street below, one thing became clear. I couldn't ignore this. Whatever they were planning, I had to find out and I had to stop it. After hearing Mark and Vivian's conversation, I knew I couldn't let them know I was onto them. Not yet. My first instinct was to confront Mark, to demand an explanation, but deep down I knew it wouldn't help. He was already lying to me, and if I tipped my hand too early, I might lose the chance to uncover what they were planning. The next day, I acted like nothing had happened. I smiled at Mark over breakfast, went to work at the cafe, and even endured a surprise visit from Vivian, without showing the anger simmering inside me. But while they thought I was oblivious, I was carefully paying attention to every little thing they said and did. I knew I needed proof, something solid to protect myself and my cafe. A few days later, I found my chance. Mark had left his briefcase on the dining table before heading out for a meeting. My heart pounded as I opened it, terrified that he might walk back in any second. Inside, I found a stack of papers. At first, they seemed harmless, just invoices and spreadsheets. But then I saw it, a document with my name on it. It was a legal transfer of ownership for the cafe, with my signature already scrawled at the bottom. Except it wasn't my signature, it was a forgery. My blood ran cold as I flipped through the pages. Mark and Vivian had been planning to steal the cafe right out from under me. I snapped photos of the documents with my phone, every shaky click of the camera feeling like a tiny victory. But I also felt the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. How could Mark do this? How could the man I loved, my husband, be so cruel? I spent the next few nights piecing things together. The missing financial records, Mark's sudden interest in managing the cafe, Vivian's constant visits. It all made sense now. They'd been building their plan for months, and I'd been blind to it. But what hurt the most wasn't the scheme itself. It was the realization that my entire marriage had been a lie. Mark had never loved me. He'd only loved the idea of taking what I'd built. One evening, I decided to confront Mark. I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I sat across from him at the dinner table, holding one of the photos of the forged document. "Care to explain this?" I asked, my voice trembling but firm. For a moment, Mark looked stunned. Then his expression shifted, his face hardening into something cold and unfamiliar. "You shouldn't have gone through my things," he said, his tone flat. Not an apology, not an explanation, just cold deflection. "Don't you dare turn this around on me," I snapped, slamming the photo onto the table. "You forged my signature, Mark. You and Vivian have been plotting against me for months. Do you really think I wouldn't figure it out?" Mark didn't deny it. He just leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms like he was annoyed by my outburst. "You're overreacting," he said. "The cafe needs proper management, Sophia. You're too emotional to handle it." "Too emotional?" I repeated, my voice rising. "That cafe is my life. I built it from nothing. And you..." My words caught in my throat as tears filled my eyes. "You're trying to take it away from me." "You don't understand," Mark said, his voice suddenly softer. "But it wasn't kindness, it was manipulation. This is for the best. You'll see." Before I could respond, Vivian walked in. Of course, she acted like she didn't know what was going on, but the smug look on her face told me everything. "What's all this shouting about?" she asked, her voice dripping with faux concern. "You know exactly what this is about," I said, glaring at her. "I found the documents, Vivian. I know what you're trying to do." Vivian didn't even flinch. "Sophia, you're being dramatic. We're just trying to help you." "Help me," I said, laughing bitterly. "By stealing my business? By forging my name? How is that help?" Her smile faded, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of anger in her eyes. "You should be grateful, Sophia. Mark and I are trying to save you from yourself. That cafe could be so much more, but you're holding it back." I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and stormed out of the apartment, my hands shaking with rage and heartbreak. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get away from them, from their lies, their manipulation, their utter lack of remorse. I ended up back at the cafe, sitting alone in the dimly lit space that had once felt like home. My heart was shattered, but I wasn't ready to give up. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to fight back. I had to. If I let them win, I'd lose not just the cafe, but a piece of myself. As I sat there in the quiet, the reality of my situation sank in. I was up against two people who had no conscience, no limits to how far they'd go to get what they wanted. But I also knew one thing for sure. They underestimated me. And that would be their biggest mistake. Sitting in the quiet of my cafe that night, I felt the full weight of what I was up against. Mark and Vivian had not just betrayed me, they were trying to destroy everything I had worked so hard to build. But I wasn't going to let them win. Not without a fight. I didn't know how I'd do it yet, but one thing was clear. I had to be smarter than them. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't face this battle alone. I needed help. So, I reached out to someone I never thought I'd need, a private investigator. His name was Dan, and though he looked like he'd stepped out of a crime novel with his gruff demeanor and wrinkled trench coat, he came highly recommended. I met Dan in the corner booth of a quiet diner, my hands gripping a folder of the evidence I'd already gathered. "I need you to help me prove what they're doing," I said, sliding the folder across the table. "They're trying to steal my cafe, and I know this is just the tip of the iceberg." Dan flipped through the photos and documents, nodding thoughtfully. "Forgery, fraud. These are serious accusations," he said. "If they've been at this for a while, I'll find out. But you need to be prepared, Sophia. This could get messy." "Messy doesn't scare me," I said, my voice firm. "Losing everything does." From that day on, Dan became my lifeline. While I focused on keeping up the appearance of normalcy at the cafe, he dug into Mark and Vivian's past. It didn't take long for him to uncover a pattern of deceit. Vivian had a history of shady legal dealings stretching back years. She had manipulated business contracts, forged documents, and even swindled money from a family trust. Mark wasn't innocent either. Dan discovered that he had been embezzling funds from his consulting clients and using me as a cover for his financial schemes. Every revelation felt like a punch to the gut. The man I had loved and trusted had been living a double life, and his mother was his accomplice. But instead of breaking me, the truth fueled my determination. I had to expose them for myself and for everyone they'd hurt. The hardest part was pretending I didn't know anything. Mark continued his charade, acting like the supportive husband while secretly working with Vivian to finalize their plan. Every time he smiled at me or casually asked about the cafe's finances, I had to bite back the urge to confront him. It was infuriating, but Dan reminded me that patience was key. "Let them think they're winning," he said. "The more confident they get, the more mistakes they'll make." And he was right. One night, I caught Mark trying to access the cafe's accounts on my laptop. He didn't notice me watching from the hallway, his face lit by the glow of the screen as he typed furiously. I didn't stop him. Instead, I quietly recorded the entire thing on my phone. It was another piece of evidence to add to the growing mountain. But things took a darker turn when Vivian's tactics escalated. She started visiting the cafe more frequently, criticizing every decision I made, and even trying to intimidate my staff. One day, she cornered me in the office, her voice low and threatening. "You're not going to win this, Sophia," she said, her eyes cold and unyielding. "Mark and I know what's best, and you're just in the way." I didn't respond. I couldn't afford to let her see the fear or anger bubbling inside me. Instead, I stared her down, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. As she walked out, I knew she was getting desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. Dan's investigation uncovered the final piece of the puzzle, evidence that Mark and Vivian had embezzled money from a charity Vivian had once chaired. It was a bombshell, proof of their greed and lack of morality. Armed with this, I filed a legal complaint. It wasn't just about protecting my cafe anymore. It was about holding them accountable for everything they had done. The day I handed the evidence to my lawyer, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. When Mark and Vivian were served with legal papers, their reactions were priceless. Mark tried to play the victim, claiming he didn't understand what was happening. Vivian, on the other hand, was livid. She stormed into the cafe, shouting accusations and threats. I calmly told her to leave, knowing that every word she said was just more proof of her desperation. As the legal battle loomed, I prepared myself for what was to come. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I also knew I wasn't alone. I had Dan, my lawyer, and a growing network of allies who believed in my fight. Most importantly, I had my own strength, something I hadn't fully realized until now. The day of the trial arrived faster than I expected, but I was ready. As I walked into the courtroom, I felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. This wasn't just about saving my cafe anymore. It was about reclaiming my life and proving that no one could take what I had worked so hard to build. Mark and Vivian sat across the room, their faces a mix of defiance and nervousness. Mark avoided my gaze, while Vivian glared at me as if she could still intimidate me. But I wasn't that naive woman anymore. I had spent too many sleepless nights preparing for this moment, and I was determined to see it through. The prosecution presented the evidence I had painstakingly gathered with Dan's help. The forged documents, the embezzled funds, the laptop recordings, it was all laid out in meticulous detail. Watching their lies unravel was both satisfying and heartbreaking. I listened as the prosecution described how Mark and Vivian had stolen from charities, manipulated contracts, and betrayed countless people, including me. Every word was a painful reminder of how much I had lost, but it was also proof that justice was within reach. When it was my turn to testify, I took a deep breath and told my story. I spoke about the love and trust one had given Mark, the way Vivian had undermined me at every turn, and the moment I discovered their plan to steal my cafe. I didn't hold back. I let the court see my pain, but I also let them see my strength. As I spoke, I noticed something shift in the courtroom. The jury, the judge, even the audience, seemed to feel the weight of my words. For so long, I had been made to feel powerless, but now, standing there, I felt like I was finally reclaiming my voice. The defense tried to discredit me, of course. Vivian's lawyer painted me as an emotional, inexperienced woman who couldn't handle running a business. But every attempt to undermine me only strengthened my resolve. I had the truth on my side, and the evidence was undeniable. The turning point came when the prosecution revealed the embezzlement scheme involving the charity. It was a bombshell, proof of their greed and lack of conscience. The courtroom erupted in whispers as the evidence was presented. Bank statements, falsified reports, and testimony from former associates who had been victims of their schemes. Mark and Vivian's confidence crumbled before my eyes. For the first time, they looked genuinely afraid. The trial lasted several days, but the verdict was clear. Mark and Vivian were found guilty on multiple counts, including fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. The judge handed down harsh sentences, long prison terms that would ensure they couldn't hurt anyone else for a very long time. As they were led away in handcuffs, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Justice had been served, but more than that, I felt free. Free from their lies, their manipulation, and the pain they had caused me. For the first time in months, I could breathe again. Rebuilding my life wasn't easy, but it was worth every struggle. The cafe, though damaged by the fire Vivian had started, became my project of healing. I worked tirelessly to restore it, pouring all my energy into making it better than ever. My community rallied around me, offering support and encouragement that reminded me why I had started this journey in the first place. When the cafe reopened, it wasn't just a business, it was a symbol of resilience and hope. Every cup of coffee I served, every smile I shared with my customers, felt like a small victory. I had faced the worst, and I had come out stronger. Looking back, I still feel the sting of betrayal, but I also feel pride. Pride that I didn't let them break me. Pride that I fought back, not just for myself, but for everyone they had wronged. And pride in the woman I've become. The woman who refused to give up. The cafe is thriving now, and so am I. Every day is a new chapter, a chance to build the legacy I've always dreamed of. I don't know what the future holds, but I know one thing for sure. I'll face it with courage, just like I've faced everything else.